I'm Allison Stanger, Director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of the International Studies Colloquium, the penultimate session. Our last one is next Friday. Many of you know our format, but for those of you who are new to us, lunch is served throughout the program. We're informal, so you should feel free to go up and get coffee or dessert. Just do it quietly. Our speaker knows we're informal, so it will not offend him. And we will conclude promptly at 1:30. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is actually no stranger to Middlebury College. In addition to speaking here on multiple occasions, Jacques Rupnik has actually taught a course during winter term. He seems to like it here, and Middlebury students, staff, and faculty alike have been enormous beneficiaries of his presence. Jacques Rupnik is one of the world's leading intellectuals on the theme of European politics broadly defined. Dr. Rupnik is the author or editor of some 14 books, by my count. He moves effortlessly between French, English, and Czech, and is well published in all these languages. He is also fluent in Russian and what was once called Serbo-Croatian, but I'm not sure how you would like me to refer to that language you speak.
Well, there are now Serbs, Croatian, and Bosnian. And maybe next month we will have Montenegrin.
Do you speak?
It's all the same language.
All the same language. What do you call the language?
It used to be called Serbo-Croatian.
He is studiously avoiding answering that question, which is probably wise. Dr. Rupnik's most recent books include International Perspectives on the Balkans and The Road to the European Union, the Czech and Slovak Republics. Both of these were published in 2003. He was educated in history and politics at the Sorbonne and the Institut d'études politiques. He then went on to receive his master's degree in Soviet studies from Harvard University and his PhD in the history of international relations from the Sorbonne. Dr. Rupnik is presently visiting professor of government and a research fellow at the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. When he finishes his stint at Harvard, he will resume his position as the director of research at CERI-Sciences-Po in Paris. He has served as executive director of the International Commission for the Balkans at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1995 to 1996. He's been an advisor to President Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, and also a visiting professor at the College of Europe. Now, it should go without saying that his most distinguished appointment to date has been as visiting professor of political science at Middlebury College in January 2000. His talk today is titled U.S. versus EU Approaches to Democracy Promotion, a topic on which he recently debated Frank Fukuyama in Paris. So today he brings his case to the Green Mountains. Please join me in welcoming Jacques Rupnik back to Middlebury College.
Well, thank you very much, Alison, for your kind introduction. I must switch off. No, switch on. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah. Well, thank you for your kind introduction, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, to recognize a few familiar faces, colleagues and friends, and to speak to such a big audience, hoping I will not spoil your appetite by talking about the difficulties of democracy, what is now called democracy promotion in America and in Europe. Let me begin by a quotation from one of my favorite authors, and I'm sure no stranger to this audience, and that's Alexis de Tocqueville, writing about Algeria in 1837. And he's writing, the quote goes as follows. Suppose, sir, for a moment, that the Emperor of China, landing on the shores of France, at the head of a powerful army, made himself master of our great cities and our capital. And after having destroyed all of the public registers, before even having given himself the pain of reading them, destroyed or dispersed all administrators without acquainting himself with the various attributes. He finally rids himself of all state officials, from the head of the government to the garde champêtre, the peers, the deputies, and in general of the entire ruling class. And that he exiled them at once to some faraway country. Do you think that this great prince, in spite of his powerful army, his fortresses, and his fortune, would soon find himself rather bothered in administering the conquered land? That his new subjects, bereft of all those who did or could manage political affairs, would be incapable of governing themselves, while he, coming from the opposite side of the earth, knows neither the religion, nor the language, nor the laws, nor the customs, nor the administrative procedures of the country, and who took care to send away all those who could have instructed him in these matters, will be in no position to rule them? You will therefore have no difficulty in seeing, sir, that if the regions of France that are effectively occupied by the conqueror were to obey him, the rest of the country would soon be left to an immense anarchy. You will see, sir, that we have done in Algeria precisely what I suppose the Emperor of China would do in France. Well, I thought that it was appropriate to quote one of the most profound and distinguished analysts of American democracy in his reflections about the traps of France's civilizing mission in Algeria, and perhaps confronted with some of the difficulties America is encountering in its democratic mission in the greater Middle East today. Europe and America share democratic values and principles, but today have somewhat different approaches to the issue of democracy promotion. These are two narratives of projection which have been seen mainly as complementary in the post-Cold War period, and which, especially since 9/11, have revealed divergent paths. This, to some extent, corresponds to the duality between the situation of the 1990s and the early 21st century. And this has been described rather wittily by Ken Jovitt, the professor from University of California, as the American approach and the international context moving from a Marxist approach, in inverted commas, that dominated the Clinton period. And that's basically the idea that globalization, the progress of international economic interchange, will lead to the spread of or create favorable environments for the spread of democracy and of human rights. Hence the convergence in that process of free marketeers and human rights activists. This, Jovitt contrasts with what he calls the Leninist approach of the Bush administration, the neoconservative assumption that democratic revolutions can be brought about with a mixture of political will and American power. The Europeans were more or less on board with the first approach, though even there were discussions or sometimes criticism of the assumption that economic globalization fosters democratic change. But they definitely parted ways with the second approach put forward by the current American administration. And the difference focuses on one hand, the underestimation of the difficulty and the complexity of democracy promotion, particularly today in the Islamic world. And secondly, the underestimation in this country, I think, of the way the rest of the world now tends to identify democracy promotion with coercion or American interference. So let me briefly look at both issues before examining the contrasting European approach. The first issue concerns the assumption underlying coercive regime change that all people aspire to freedom and democracy, and it is therefore plausible that toppling of a dictatorship from outside will allow democracy to flourish from inside. This has several snags. One is that democracy is there identified essentially as elections, having an election, but it underestimates the fact that there are, by definition, unpredictable and consequences, and you might end up facing a situation that is, to put it diplomatically, not favorable to the spread of liberal democracy. You know, the list is long, and I will not dwell on it, but you could see the elections in Iraq as a major shining example for the rest of the Middle East. You could also say maybe this is a beginning of a new ethnocracy. Maybe this is also giving Iran a new leverage because there is a Shiite minority, a Shiite majority running Iraq, and suddenly Iran, which is now seen as the main problem, has a newfound leverage. In fact, Iran, another case where you had an election, perhaps not perfect according to Western standards, but on the whole, it was a democratic election. It brought to power people who have, you know, a very peculiar view of democracy and certainly a very hostile view to some of the democratic neighbors in the region. Israel, to be very explicit. You can go through the whole list of situations. Look at the way Hezbollah has been established as a powerful force. It was already, but it has increased its power in Lebanon, and most recently Hamas victory in the Palestinian election. So that is simply to say democratic election, that is fine, but you are not sure that this is going to enhance what we understand as liberal democracy. It might end up creating an environment that is not necessarily favorable to democracy. Similarly, the question of the state. Toppling of a regime and dismantling the state, much the way Tocqueville describes the imaginary Chinese conquest of France, that is, of course, important to smash Saddam's legacy, but doesn't necessarily help you in trying to establish a liberal democracy, a functioning liberal order. So there you have at least two reservations on the part of Europeans, both on the merits of elections as a necessary but not sufficient condition, and secondly, on the need, when toppling dictatorship, to confront the day after and the question of institution and state building. And the second issue where Europeans have problems with the current American approach to democracy promotion is that the whole concept of coercive regime change has undermined what America has always been associated with and has been great at, and that is the idea of democracy from below, democracy and civil society, again back to Tocqueville. That was actually his main argument about America, about democracy in America. I'm sure you have in your classes read at least some of it. And that really was a distinguishing feature in the past, or one of the main distinguishing features of America's approach to democracy promotion, that it was not only concerned about having a vibrant civil society in America, but that it was also spreading democracy or trying to encourage democracy building through support of civil society, NGOs, in various parts of the world. I've been very much involved in the Balkans in the 1990s, and I've seen a lot of that at work there, and sometimes with very good results. Now, the problem is that this recent approach to coercive regime change and import of democracy has contributed to the discrediting of this other very strong American approach, which was the civil society idea and the democracy promotion from below. This is an argument, I cannot dwell on it, that is developed very well by Thomas Carruthers in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs. Thomas Carruthers has written extensively on democracy promotion in Latin America, in various parts of the world. He basically makes the argument that the way the Bush administration has used the word democracy promotion, it has now increasingly created around the world the equation democracy promotion means regime change, and this has been used in turn by authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes in various parts of the world, in China, in Russia, in Latin America, in various parts of the world, to crack down on NGOs or inconvenient civil society activists under the pretext that democracy promotion is merely a code word for American interventionism. And to be sure, a lot of the NGOs we have seen in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Serbia, have had American support. And that has clearly now changed. You have seen the recent attitude of the Russian, of Putin's regime, the new law on NGOs, Lukashenko's preemptive strike against all NGO activities. All this, all of them have used, I'm not saying that they're right to use it, but got the opportunity to use it to crack down on civil society and NGOs as an important part of the democratic change. So to point this is not to mark European cynicism or lack of concern for the diffusion of democratic values. It may simply reflect, first, a prudential argument derived from history. Post-revolutionary France had its own experience with, it was not called democracy promotion under Napoleon, but it could have been described that way. But it mainly reflects a very different approach to the way democracy can be fostered from outside. America has a clear and explicit ambition of spreading democracy. It is the beacon on the hill, the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright has called it. America's democratic providentialism has become the organizing vision of the current administration. So the vision thing of Bush Sr. has been replaced by the mission thing of Bush Jr. The ambition is backed by unprecedented military and economic power and a global strategic concept. The European Union has nothing of the sort. It is a community of democracies, but it does not have a global democracy projection blueprint. Nor does it have power projection capacity. it relies on mimetism and the promise of inclusion. Europe does not bring democracy through the threat of invading a country, but through the threat of non-invading it. The greatest threat the EU can profess towards a country in its neighborhood is not to include it in the European Union. That is the ultimate threat we can deliver, and that is, of course, the most effective threat in terms of democracy promotion, in terms of democratic change, because it all relies on the attraction of the European model to the democratizing countries on its periphery, and it really corresponds to what Konrad Adenauer in his days had called Magnet Europa, Europe as a magnet. It attracts the countries of its periphery, and the leverage it has over the countries that want to join it is, of course, a key ingredient in making democratic change happen, not through a one-off toppling of a regime or an election, but through a long, protracted process of institution building. So I would argue that the European Union has been perhaps the most effective, though certainly not the only one, democracy promoter on its periphery, for which it has not been designed and has rarely gotten credit for, even from the recent members who directly benefited from it, if I can add. So I want briefly to examine the way this has worked in three different situations, which reflect three different trajectories of democratization in post-communist Europe. And each of them posing different kind of questions or different kind of challenges to the European Union. And I will be, for time reasons, will be very sketchy in doing so. One is what I've just referred to, democratization through institution building, through inclusion. That is the Central European model. This is how it has worked in countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, etc. The second model is the Balkans, democratizing protectorates, democratizing European protectorates in the Balkans after the war. That is the second case study that you can discuss. And the third case would be the impact of the European Union on the periphery, on its neighborhood, which happens to be also the neighborhood of Russia. I'm talking about the periphery of the former Soviet Union, from the Ukraine to the Caucasus. So very briefly, let us look at these three situations. In the first situation, we are talking of the main success story, that is the way a transition to democracy has been consolidated through the prospect of European integration. I mean, it is not the European Union that has contributed in a decisive way to the downfall of the old regime. No, but it has contributed significantly through the process usually described as conditionality, through the consolidation of those democracies. If one were to put it in a nutshell what the main issue is, the thinking of the 1980s, when communism was being toppled, was the main enemy is the state, dismantle the state. And you would have, because the state was seen as oppressive, that it was a totalitarian state, and therefore the main idea that you have both from the political liberals, if you want, the ex-dissidents, the human rights fighters, they consider the state as the main problem, and the free marketeer economists. They also consider the rollback of the state as the priority. That was sort of the thinking at the moment when the revolution occurred. Political liberal, economic liberals converge in the attempt to dismantle the state as a precondition for successful democracy. The main lesson of the 1990s, very relevant to the accession to the European Union, is that you do not have a functioning democracy if you haven't built the rule of law, if you do not have functioning state institutions. You know, what is the point of having rights if you do not have institutions that are capable of upholding them, of defending them, of implementing them? So this is, of course, where the whole process of European integration has been very important. The key condition for joining the European Union, according to the Copenhagen criteria, is not only to be a democracy. That's the first and non-negotiable condition. You want to join? You must be a democracy. You must respect human rights. But more than that, you must have institutions that are compatible with the functioning of the European Union. And that means independent judiciary, public administration that is competent and non-corrupt, decentralization, etc., etc. So this EU conditionality has been important for the countries that were joining, but has been important for the European Union itself, because in defining the criteria for people to join, you are defining what you are. So if you say these are the democratic conditions for people to join, this is making explicit what you really stand for. And you can look at the way this has worked, even with, not just with the democratic liberal elites that triumphed after 1989. This has proved effective even with the illiberal elites that have triumphed, as in Slovakia in the 1990s, as in Romania, in Bulgaria in the 1990s. Basically, the cost of being excluded from joining the European Union has proved too high for even those illiberal elites that sought, for various other reasons, to go it along, to have their own brand of semi-authoritarian populist nationalism. Even those had to eventually accept or adapt or allow alternation in power. This is what happened in Slovakia. Slovakia would be the perfect textbook case for that. You have the Mečiar authoritarian regime, which is building the Slovak state. You have 1997, the decision by the European Union to give the list of countries that are going to join. Open negotiation. Slovakia is missing. That creates a major shock in Slovak society. There is an important civil society mobilization. In the election of 90, Mečiar regime is defeated, and you have a very heterogeneous, eclectic coalition that comes in that has as a common denominator joining the European Union. I mean, and the electoral sequence was perfect, because you have the elections where at the end of September you had actually the NATO summit, not unimportant, was in November, and you had in December the decision at the Copenhagen summit about would Slovakia join or not the European Union. So for the, that focuses the mind of not only the political elites, but also of the voters. Another case would be very interesting is Turkey. Whatever you think about the merits or not of Turkish membership in the European Union, and there are a lot of problems with that, but I think few people would dispute that since the go-ahead that was given at the Helsinki summit in December 1999, Turkey has, witnessed formidable democratic change. I mean, I would not call it regime change, but simply for the sake of argument, I would contrast the regime change that has occurred in Turkey over the last 6 years, since basically they got the go-ahead for joined the European Union, with the regime change in neighboring Iraq. You would have two very interesting case studies. And I know the difference between the situation, but I'm simply using deliberately the term to show how the European leverage or the prospect of membership has worked both with the political elite and mainly the message that is given. The democratization is not a one-off thing, it's a process, and it concerns institution building, and that is the main European message that has worked in integrating Central Europe. The second case study, and I can only very briefly mention it, is the Balkans, Europe and the Balkans. There we have had, after a decade of war associated with the breakup of Yugoslavia, international protectorates or semi-protectorates in Bosnia, in Kosovo, even the Macedonia is or Serbia, Montenegro are states that live under very close international supervision. Now, the main lesson from the Balkans in the 1990s that you have very little chance in a successful democratic transition if you do not have a consensus on the territorial framework of democracy. This actually is also a lesson for Iraq, if it were to break up. The Kurdish question is, of course, at the back of everybody's mind, certainly at the back of Turkish minds. That is the main lesson. If you do not have a consensus about the territorial framework, you have very strong chance that this process will be derailed, and you have a very strong emphasis on collective national nation-state building, if you want, as a priority, as opposed to building democratic institutions, checks and balances, individual citizenship, etc. So the novelty for the European Union that it is involved, first of all, in attempting to foster democracy through protectorates, which is a new question, and at the same time having to create the territorial framework, the new territorial framework after Yugoslavia. This is the negotiations we are involved with now, at this very moment. Next month, Montenegro will be voting about its independence. Will it stay together with Serbia or not? We are currently engaged in talks about the status of Kosovo. There has been a war in Kosovo, there has been international intervention in Kosovo, but since then there has been a kind of Europeanized protectorate. I say Europeanized because it's essentially run by Europeans. In Bosnia it was Padjadždown until recently. In Kosovo, well, it started with Bernard Kouchner, and there's a long list of European dignitaries, most of them from Scandinavia, who have been running the place. And so the question is, how do we solve these two interconnected issues? First, can you bring democracy through a protectorate? Great doubts about that, because you can create conditions for elections. This is what we have been successful. But to the extent you have a protectorate, it means somebody else is making the final decisions about the key political issues. So you have a democracy building which is like an empty shelf, or risks at being an empty shelf. You have a newly elected parliament in Kosovo, but it cannot decide about some of the most important issues, such as taxation, such as privatizations, for instance. So, no taxation without representation. That is the basis of democracy. If you're building a new democratic system and you take away the budget from the parliament, well, what kind of democracy are you building? So you have to tackle the territorial question first in order to have a successful democratic transition. And this is where the European Union comes in. That is the only way, I believe, to solve the territorial unfinished business of former Yugoslavia, the only way to persuade the nationalist political elites in the would-be successor states is actually to promise them something bigger than what they're losing, or what they think they're losing, if they're abandoning Kosovo for the Serbs, or if they are giving away such and such goal of the nationalist agenda. The only bigger thing that they can think of, and that anybody can offer, is a promise of membership in the European Union. And the two things have to be interconnected. The two things will have to be interconnected, because it's not something you can solve on a one-off basis. There will have to be a comprehensive European approach. So this is where the European Union is confronted with an entirely new challenge. For the first time, it is involved in nation-state building. Normally, to join the European Union, you have to be a functioning state. You are an existing state. You have established democracy, and you are negotiating the conditions according to the pattern we have seen in Central Europe, in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia. They've all gone through this. In the Balkans, this is an entirely new situation. The European Union is actually involved in nation-state building as a condition for democratic change. So this is an entirely new predicament. The European Union has never been made for that. It's not prepared for that. But that's what it's doing. In saying Bosnia must stay together, the European Union is saying something about statehood. In saying Montenegro can become independent if 55% of the people vote in the elections, in the referendum, it's European Union who has invented the hybrid state of Serbia-Montenegro. Never existed. I mean, it was a new thing. All of Yugoslavia had broken up. It was Mr. Solana who presided over the creation of this creature called Serbia-Montenegro. That is European direct involvement in creating a state. Same thing with Kosovo. But you can have the Serbs accept the loss of Kosovo only on the condition that they're getting into the EU, and you will get the Albanians understanding that their independence is not 19th century sovereignty, but that it's conditional independence, that it's 21st century sovereignty, shared sovereignty in the region within the context of the European Union. So this is a very, the solution of the Balkan puzzle will depend on the capacity of the European Union to propose a regional framework and rethink the way it has enlarged so far. This is an entirely new concept. And it's difficult for an institution that has successfully completed one process to move to another process. I mean, the easy solution or the obvious solution is, why don't we just continue and let them do their homework, and when they're ready, they will tell us. But in the meantime, we might have a couple of wars on our hands. So that's the reason why we have to rethink. Third case, and I will really simply mention it, is the periphery of the European Union, which happens to be, as I said, the periphery of Russia, the neighborhood. Russians call it the near abroad. And you have all read about the so-called colored revolutions, the Georgian Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. They are all lumped together somewhat too conveniently because we discover now that there is great diversity and that perhaps also some debunking is necessary. A Middlebury graduate from Georgia has now completed a book which will be published soon, and he calls it's Irkali Areshidze. And he, I was recently with him on a panel at a conference, gave a remarkable paper entitled Georgia's Undemocratic Revolution. And basically he calls this revolution a popular coup, which has little to do with democracy. So a bit of debunking is necessary. His book, I think, will be an important contribution to that. But still, there is the more general question that these new revolutions pose. And that is, for those who missed the 1989 train, there's a second chance. And that's good news. And clearly, in the argument that a few years ago has opposed Fareed Zakaria, who I think is also has been a visitor here, and Mark Plattner from the National Endowment on Democracy, they had an argument, published articles on the subject, and Fareed Zakaria's argument was, yes, you have a spread of elections, but not democracy. Democracy requires the rule of law, becomes a long-term process, and therefore what we have is electocracies. We have a semi-authoritarian regimes which have elections, and we call it democracy. It's good for the, Freedom House Index is improving every year, like a 5-year plan under socialists, we're increasing our democratic quota every year. But, the democratic substance is not there. That would be the Fareed Zakaria argument. You are doing the things in reverse. In the West, you have developed, the rule of law, then representative democracy, and this has created the liberal democracies as we know them. What we are trying to do it in a reverse order, and it doesn't always work, and he gives a very powerful argument for that. The counter-argument was from Mark Plattner, who was saying, well, that may well be so. We have these electocracies. How do you do away with them? What do you do about them? You don't like the result of this election? What do you do? Well, the best way is to have another election. You campaign for another election. You try to make the conditions of the next election more favorable to democratic change. And therefore, this is where the colored revolution come in. You organize with the help of NGOs, with the help of civil society, with the help of independent media, etc., etc. You try to mobilize society. First, to make sure that the election is not stolen, that you want to get the count right, so you have exit polls, etc. And more generally, you are trying to steer or to shift, to tip the balance, as has been the case in Ukraine, in particular, in the direction of democratic change. So the argument, Fareed Zakaria versus Plattner is still there, but the colored revolution poses us an interesting new take on it, with, I think, the main difference with 1989, pointed out by Václav Havel. In an interview I did with him a year ago, I asked him, do you see the similarities, the parallels with the Velvet Revolution in Prague, 1989? He says, well, the similarities, there are people on the square, they're waving keys or flags, and, eventually if they do it often enough, the government resigns, which is, the superficial similarity. The main difference is 1989, these were revolutions against communism. The revolutions, the so-called colored revolutions, they are revolutions against post-communism. And what is post-communism, he says? Post-communism is a mixture of authoritarian regime and mafia capitalism. So that's as concise definition as I can think of. And I don't know whether political scientists will buy it, but I buy it, and it's certainly worth for the purpose of our discussion. Because what has been interesting and important in the changes in these colored revolution is not just the role of the NGOs. I mean, we have seen in the Ukrainian case, etc. This was important. In Belgrade, in Kiev, etc. They played an important role. But what has been very important is the role of the European Union, the European prospect. The main candidate against Milosevic, the DOS coalition, against Yushchenko's coalition, their main argument is we need to make this democratic change so that we get closer to Europe, so that we get a chance of European integration. Doesn't mean they will get it, but that was certainly the intention, and that is the importance, again, of the Magnet Europa argument. And you have seen during the Ukrainian crisis, the impact of the new members on the EU, on the European Union. Polish president, Lithuanian president, together with Mr. Solana, that I have just mentioned, the European, if you want, foreign minister, going to Kiev during the crisis, averting a clash, averting possible slide into violence, and for the first time deserved praise even from Robert Kagan, who wrote an op-ed piece, entitled "Embraceable EU," because he thought that EU actually did have a use in that particular context. So this third case is interesting because it combines what the Americans were good at, democracy from below, NGOs, etc., and what the European leverage or attraction is. Will it produce democratic change? That is far from obvious, partly because there is this backlash that I mentioned and that Thomas Carruthers has discussed, the backlash against NGOs and civil society activities right now in some of these countries. I mentioned the colored revolution. As you have noticed, the denim revolution didn't occur because a preemptive strike by President Lukashenko in Belarus made sure that the same would not be repeated. But you have also within the European Union differences of emphasis in the priority you give to democratizing this periphery or establishing some kind of viable relationship with Russia. This is the main debate now in the European Union. To simplify it, the new members put greater emphasis on the priority of democratic change in the neighborhood because they think that this is the best way to roll back Russian influence and the best way to enhance their security, for reasons that I don't have to spell at length. The view from so-called old Europe is sometimes, well, we still need a partnership with Russia for security reasons. You want to fight the war on terror. For energy reasons, a quarter of European energy comes from Russia. You say, oh, you might change your supplier. Can you? You go to Iran, you go to Middle East, go to Hugo Chavez. I don't know. I mean, it's not easy to shift your supplier these days. So this is a debate now in the European Union, and the priority of democracy promotion and the relationship with Russia, which means that this third case, really, this colored revolution, they raise the issue for the European Union of democracy promotion as a major geopolitical stake in the redefinition of the European Union's relationship with Russia. So we have three situations, three different issues for the EU, and I will now simply conclude in telegraphic style with three brief points. I said that the good news is that those who failed in 1989, get a second chance now. That's Mark Plattner's argument, give them a chance, and sometimes it works. The bad news is, of course, that those who did succeed after 1989 are already suffering from premature democratic fatigue. And if you look at the state of Central European democracy nowadays, the Polish case is, of course, the most obvious illustration. You have, rise of populist, nationalist, very certainly not liberal views of democracy, and a very skeptical approach to the European Union itself. So that raises, of course, the question, the European leverage works, but it works until you get in. How long does it work after is an open question. The second point is that European and American approaches, which I have contrasted for the sake of our argument here, and perhaps overstated the contrast, they are, can also be seen as in many ways complementary, especially when you look at the troubled southern periphery of Europe, the whole space going from Algeria to the Middle East. And there you will need a new articulation of the combination of American presence, even military presence, and European soft power. And thirdly, finally, the very idea of democracy promotion, of course, should make us all the more demanding concerning the state of our established democracies, old or new. And it is not easy to export democracy if you suffer from this premature fatigue or if you are in a state of democratic anemia. So to promote democracy and human rights, you must make sure that they are alive in your midst. Democracy promotion, European or American, must always begin at home. Thank you for your attention.